The medic's name was Vale Soren, and she had seen things that would make most sentient beings request immediate psychological counseling and a one-way ticket to the nearest retirement colony. She had patched up Krath warriors after plasma skirmishes. She had sutured the 7-chambered hearts of Delvani soldiers with her eyes half closed from exhaustion. She had once spent 11 hours reconstructing the exoskeletal framework of a Brune commander who had, by all measurable metrics, absolutely no business still being alive. Vale Soren was not, by any reasonable definition, a being who got surprised anymore. And then she met Corporal Pete Okafor. Now, before we get into what happened in that medical bay, let me give you a little context, because context matters here. The joint operation on Relos IV had gone poorly. That is the diplomatic way of saying it. The non-diplomatic way involved 17 specific words that I will spare you, but the gist is this. 3 Alliance species, 1 very angry insurgent faction armed with Thoric-grade disruptors, and a narrow canyon that somebody's tactical AI had confidently labeled as, quote, low-probability engagement zone. The tactical AI has since been retrained several times. Vale was stationed aboard the MCS Viridian, a mid-tier Alliance medical frigate that smelled perpetually of antiseptic solution and quiet desperation. She was, on this particular rotation, the senior field medic. When the evac pods started coming in from Relos IV, she was already gloved, already standing, already doing that thing she did where she looked completely calm, while her secondary heart rate quietly climbed to alarming speeds. The first pod contained 2 Krath soldiers with standard disruptor burns. Vale processed them in under 4 minutes. Efficient, professional, unremarkable. The second pod contained a Delvani scout with a fractured cranial plate and what appeared to be mild emotional distress about the fractured cranial plate. Vale processed him in 6 minutes, primarily because he kept moving his head while she was trying to work. The third pod contained Corporal Pete Okafor of the 14th Human Expeditionary Unit. And this is where things got interesting. Pete came through the hatch upright, which was already suspicious, because the pod's internal sensors had flagged him as a priority medical case. Priority medical cases did not typically walk. They were carried. They were dragged. They occasionally floated in a way that made everyone nearby deeply uncomfortable. They did not walk through hatches while apparently attempting to make casual conversation with the Viridian's docking crew. "Hey," Pete said to Corporal Zen Basra, who was managing the docking interface and was entirely unprepared for a blood-covered human to address him conversationally. "Is there coffee on this ship? I've been in that pod for 40 minutes and the beverage situation was genuinely offensive." Zen Basra stared. Pete noticed Zen staring and looked down at himself, presumably to identify the source of concern. He found it fairly quickly. There was a great deal of blood. It was coming from his left side, where the fabric of his tactical vest had been partially vaporized by what the Viridian's diagnostic scanner would later identify as a Theric-grade disruptor shot at close range. "Oh, that," Pete said. "Yeah, I need someone to look at that." Vale Soren looked at it. She looked at it for a long time. The disruptor wound was real. That was not in question. The scanner confirmed it within seconds of Pete lying down on the treatment surface. A Theric-grade discharge, partial penetration, left lateral torso, approximately 8 centimeters in diameter. The wound had cauterized partially on contact, which was the only reason the internal damage wasn't catastrophically worse. The heat signature residue indicated the shot had been fired from less than 2 meters away. Vale pulled up the standard treatment matrix for disruptor wounds of this classification. The matrix had a clearly labeled section titled Expected Patient Status at Time of Treatment, and that section listed 4 possibilities: incapacitated, unconscious, deceased, or, in extremely rare cases involving Krath physiology specifically, stable but immobile. There was no option for requesting coffee and asking about the local time zone. She began the preliminary scan. The scanner did its job, building a layered image of Pete's internal structure with the kind of methodical patience that only machines truly possess. Vale watched the image construct itself in real time and the more she watched, the more a very specific expression settled onto her face. It was the expression of a being who is looking at data that doesn't match anything in their reference library. "Corporal," she said. "Pete," he said. "Corporal is a lot of syllables." "Pete," she said. Because she was professional and this was not the time to explain the military conventions of address to a being who was apparently impervious to both disruptors and social norms. "How long ago were you hit?" Pete thought about it. "Maybe 55 minutes? Somewhere in there. There was about 15 minutes of running after that, so timing gets a little fuzzy." Vale looked at the scan. She looked at the wound. She looked back at the scan. "You ran," she said. "Had to. We were extracting Delvani civvies from the northern ridge. There was a second insurgent unit blocking the primary route, so we went around the long way." He paused. "Uphill, there was a silence in the medical bay that had a very specific texture to it. You sustained a thorax-grade disruptor wound to your lateral torso," Vale said, slowly, the way someone speaks when they are trying to give the universe an opportunity to correct its error. "And then ran uphill for 15 minutes while evacuating civilians." 12 civilians, Pete offered. "And one Delvani elder who was extremely opposed to being carried, so that was more of a negotiation situation." Vale set down her scanner. This was a significant gesture. Vale Soren did not set down tools mid-examination. Tools in hand meant focus, meant professionalism, meant the controlled environment she required to function at peak competence. Setting down the scanner meant something had interrupted that system at a fundamental level. She looked at his wound again. The cauterization was real. The depth of the discharge was real. The secondary tissue damage visible on the scan was real. By every standard she had trained against, by every case she had studied across 4 years at the Melkari Institute and 6 years of field experience, Pete Okafor should not be capable of sustained exertion. He should, in the most technical terms available, be in a significantly worse situation than he was currently in. "Your species," Vale said, in a tone that a linguist might describe as controlled bafflement, "is impossible." Pete blinked. "Is that a medical assessment?" "It's an observation." She picked up her scanner again, because the only solution to inexplicable data was more data. "Hold still. Now, here's something you should understand about Vale Soren before we continue. She was not the kind of medic who got emotionally invested in cases. This was not because she lacked empathy. She had plenty of empathy. It was well documented. Her supervisors mentioned it in her annual evaluations. It was because emotional investment was a liability in field medicine, and Vale had spent a decade carefully constructing the professional distance that let her do her job effectively. She was about to start dismantling that distance, one inexplicable human at a time, and she had absolutely no idea. The deeper scan took 7 minutes. During those 7 minutes, Pete Okafor asked 3 questions about the ship's layout, made 1 observation about the Viridian's lighting system that was, Vale had to admit, actually fairly accurate, and politely declined her offer of a mild sedative on the grounds that he wanted to stay aware of his surroundings, which was the kind of reasoning that made complete logical sense and still somehow felt absurd given that his surroundings were a medical bay and he had a disruptor wound. The scan finished. Vale reviewed the results. The disruptor discharge had caused significant damage to the lateral muscle groups, partial scoring on the lower left rib structure, and secondary heat trauma to the surrounding tissue. The internal organs were, by some margin that Vale was not equipped to explain, intact. Not just intact. The scan showed active cellular response in the damaged tissue, the kind of biological repair signal that typically appeared 6 to 12 hours post-injury under controlled treatment conditions. Pete's body had started repairing itself on its own in the field while he was running uphill. "Is something wrong?" Pete asked. He was watching her face, and he had apparently noticed that her face was doing something she wasn't consciously authorizing it to do. "Define wrong," Vile said. "Like, is it worse than it looks, or is it a weird shape, or—" He trailed off. "You're looking at me like I'm a math problem." "You are a math problem," Vale said. which was not the most professional response she had ever given a patient, but was the most accurate. She turned the scan display toward him so he could see it. This is active cellular regenerative response. In humans, under normal circumstances, this process begins after medical intervention has stabilized the injury site. It does not begin spontaneously, mid-activity, in the field. Pete looked at the scan. He looked at it the way someone looks at something when they understand maybe 40% of what they're seeing and are attempting to appear more confident than that. Is that bad? No, Vale said. It is not bad. It is just, and I want to be precise here, not supposed to happen. Pete considered this. Well, he said finally, I mean, the body does what it needs to do. Val stared at him. That is not an explanation, she said. I know, he agreed, completely pleasantly. I don't really have a better one. She began treatment because regardless of what Pete's biology was apparently choosing to do on its own, the wound still needed proper attention. The cauterized edges had to be cleaned and properly sealed. The secondary tissue damage required accelerant therapy to support the repair process that was already, inexplicably, underway. And the scoring on the rib structure needed monitoring, because even if humans were apparently operating by a different set of rules than every other species Vale had treated, bones were bones, and bones responded to physics. While she worked, she asked him questions. She told herself this was standard patient intake protocol. She was not entirely honest with herself. Pete Okafor was 29 years old, or approximately equivalent to that in Galactic Standard Time. He was from a coastal region of a country called Nigeria, which he explained was a significant nation on the primary human continent, then immediately amended that to one of the continents. There's actually a few, which required a moment of geographic recalibration on Vale's part, because she had only ever interacted with humans in military context and had not previously engaged with the full scope of their planet's organizational complexity. He had joined the Expeditionary Unit 4 years ago, after the Alliance had established formal partnership protocols with the human homeworld. Before that, he had worked, and this was the part that made Vale pause mid-suture in emergency medicine. On Earth, as a paramedic, you, Vale said, were a medical responder, before the military. Yeah, Pete said, and now you're in a combat unit. I cross-trained, seemed useful. Vale resumed the suture. She thought about this for approximately 9 seconds before arriving at a question that had been forming since she first saw him walk through the hatch. How many times have you been injured in the field? She asked. Significant injuries, the kind that required treatment. Pete actually had to think about it. This in itself was information. This is the third disruptor hit, he said. Both the other ones were less bad than this. There was a structural collapse on Meridian Station that cracked 2 ribs and gave me a concussion. That was about 18 months ago, and he appeared to be genuinely running an inventory. A pressure suit breach on the Cassian outpost, but that was fixed fast, so it barely counts. Third disruptor hit, Vale said. Yeah, you have been shot by a disruptor weapon, Vale said, very carefully. 3 times. Technically, the first time wasn't a direct hit, more of a glancing blow, so some people might say 2.5, but I'm not going to be pedantic about it. Vale finished the suture and stepped back from the treatment surface. She looked at Pete Okafor, who was lying there looking completely alert, which he had no medical right to be, in a medical bay on a ship he'd never been on before, explaining his injury history with the casual tone of someone describing mildly inconvenient weather. And for the first time in 6 years of field medicine, Vale Soren experienced something she would later, privately, describe as awe. Not the comfortable, contained kind of awe that comes from witnessing something beautiful. The sharp, slightly frightening kind that comes from understanding that you are dealing with something you genuinely do not have a complete framework for. You should rest, she told him. Probably, Pete agreed, with the easy agreeability of someone who intended to comply once they finished their own mental checklist. I'll have a full panel run in the morning, she said. I want to monitor the cellular response rates. Sure, he said. Is there actually coffee on this ship? I wasn't joking about that. There was, it turned out, a human-compatible caffeine blend in the Viridian's commissary, stocked because 3 other humans were currently assigned to the ship's crew. Vale authorized it. She stood at the medical bay entrance for a moment after the orderly left to retrieve it, and she looked back at Pete, who was already attempting to find a more comfortable position on the treatment surface, with the focused determination of a being whose primary concern at this moment was not his disruptor wound, but the angle of the surface. She thought about the scan, the spontaneous cellular response, the fact that he had run uphill, the fact that this was his 3rd disruptor hit. She thought about the expression that her colleague, Dr. Harvin Tolka, used when describing humans. Harvin had treated humans twice before, and had come to Vale afterward, both times looking slightly destabilized in a way she had found, at the time, mildly dramatic. She understood now that Harvin had simply been accurately reporting his experience. "Pete," she said. He looked over. "In the morning," she said. "I'm going to have a lot of questions." Pete smiled. It was a very easy smile, the kind that seems to come without any particular effort. And it did not help Vale's composure in any measurable way. "I've got time," he said. The morning brought 3 things to the MCS Viridian: a shift rotation, a minor navigational correction that made the ship hum at a slightly different frequency for about 4 minutes, and Vale Soren arriving at the medical bay 45 minutes before her official start time with a data tablet, a prepared list of 17 questions, and the kind of focused energy that her colleagues had learned to recognize as either a breakthrough or a breakdown, depending on the day. Pete Okafor was already awake. This was not, by itself, surprising. Humans apparently had variable sleep cycles that didn't map cleanly onto the Viridian's standard rest periods. What was surprising was that Pete was awake, had apparently already acquired coffee from somewhere, was sitting up on the treatment surface with his legs hanging off the edge, and was engaged in what appeared to be a friendly conversation with Ensign Dreva Pol, the Viridian's youngest crew member, who was supposed to be running morning diagnostic checks on the bay equipment, and was instead laughing at something Pete had just said. Dreva noticed Vale first, straightened immediately, and relocated to the diagnostic panel, with the practiced speed of someone who had been caught not working enough times to develop excellent reflexes about it. Pete just looked over and said, "Morning, you're early." "I'm precise," Vale said. "Sure," Pete said, in a tone that suggested he found this distinction charming rather than corrective. Vale set down her tablet and ran the first scan of the day before she said anything else, because data before conversation was a principle she held firmly and intended to keep holding firmly regardless of how disorienting this particular patient was proving to be. The scanner swept, processed, and delivered its report in under 2 minutes. She looked at the results for longer than 2 minutes. The cellular repair process had continued overnight. Not just continued, it had accelerated. The secondary tissue damage that she had assessed as requiring 48 to 60 hours of recovery time under standard treatment protocol had reduced measurably. The scoring on the rib structure was showing active calcification response, which in every other species she treated required either direct medical stimulation or a recovery window of several days minimum. Pete's body had apparently decided that recovery windows were a suggestion. "How do you feel?" Vale asked. "Honestly?" "Pretty good," Pete said, and then added, with the self-awareness of someone who recognized this was probably not the medically expected answer. "I know that sounds wrong." "It doesn't sound wrong," Vale said. "It scans as wrong. There is a difference." She turned the display toward him again, pointing to the repair progression markers. "This is your tissue recovery rate from last night's baseline to this morning. This rate is approximately 2.5 times what I would project for any species I have treated at this injury classification." Pete looked at the scan with the same 40% comprehension expression as the night before. "Huh?" he said. "Huh?" Vale repeated. "That's your response. I mean, I don't know what else to say. I've always healed pretty fast. My mother used to say I was stubborn even at the cellular level." He paused. She meant it as a compliment, mostly. Vale sat down on the stool across from him, pulled up her tablet, and decided that they were going to do this systematically, because systematic was the only mode she trusted when the situation was actively resisting her existing frameworks. "I have questions," she said. "You mentioned," Pete said. "I'd like honest answers, not reassuring ones." Pete considered this. That's a surprisingly specific request. It's a necessary one. In my experience, injured patients trend toward reassurance. They minimize. They say they're fine when the scan is telling me they're not fine. I don't need that from you. What I need is accurate information. Something shifted in Pete's expression. Something subtle, like a layer of easy casualness settling into something more attentive. "All right," he said. "Honest answers. Go ahead." Vale looked at her list. 17 questions, organized by category: physiological history, injury response, pain perception, and a final section she had labeled simply behavioral, because she hadn't found a better word for the cluster of things she wanted to understand about why Pete Okafor had walked through a hatch after a Theric-grade disruptor wound, and asked about coffee. She started with physiological history, and Pete answered everything directly, the way he had said he would. He had no known anomalous medical history. His pre-enlistment physical had flagged nothing unusual. His recovery rate from minor injuries had always been fast, but not implausibly so. Nothing that had ever prompted a medical review or drawn significant attention. The Relos 5-4 wound was the most severe injury he had sustained, and he agreed that the speed of his current recovery was beyond his own normal baseline. "So it scales," Vale said, almost to herself. "What does?" The response. "It appears to scale with injury severity." She was making notes rapidly. Minor injuries recover fast, which reads as within the outer range of normal variation. Major injuries trigger an accelerated response that exceeds what minor injuries would suggest. She looked up. "Your body is not simply fast at recovery. It prioritizes resources based on severity. That's a different system." Pete was quiet for a moment. "Is that unusual?" "For every species in my clinical experience, yes." Vale set the tablet down. "Most biologicals have a fairly fixed recovery ceiling. Krath are physically resilient but slow to heal. Their advantage is damage resistance, not repair speed. Delvani have excellent organ redundancy but standard tissue recovery. Brune have high pain tolerance, but their healing is chemical dependent. They require specific compounds to trigger the process at all." She paused. "Humans appear to have a dynamic system that responds to threat level. The greater the damage, the more aggressively the repair process engages." "Huh?" Pete said again. "You keep saying that. It keeps being the right word." Vale almost smiled. She registered the impulse and categorized it under responses to manage later. She moved to pain perception, which was the section she had been quietly anticipating, because pain perception was where she expected the data to get complicated. She asked Pete to describe, as accurately as possible, his experience of pain from the disruptor wound from the moment of impact through the evacuation and arrival on the Viridian. Pete thought about it seriously before answering, which she appreciated. "It hurt," he said. "A lot, initially. Like a genuine, significant, this is bad level of pain. I won't minimize that." He paused, choosing words carefully. "But there's a thing that happens under adrenaline in high-stress situations where the pain becomes information rather than experience. You feel it, you register it, you understand what it's telling you about your body's status, but it doesn't override the operational picture. It goes into the background." Vale wrote this down word for word. "That process," she said, "is that trained or inherent?" "Both," Pete said. "You train it, but humans can do it innately to some degree. Kids who break a limb on a playground will sometimes keep playing for several minutes before they process what happened. Adrenaline suppresses the full pain signal and keeps the motor system functional." He tilted his head slightly. "You've never seen this in other species? Krath have adrenaline analogs, but the effect is much shorter duration, and it doesn't suppress pain signal. It simply narrows focus." "Delvani," Vale paused. "Delvani feel pain acutely and immediately. Their response to significant injury is shutdown of non-essential function. It is an effective protective mechanism, but it makes them non-functional in the field after serious injury. That's why the Delvani scouts in the canyon needed extraction, Pete said. And it wasn't a question. He was connecting information, and connecting it quickly. Yes, Vale said. 3 Delvani scouts sustained injuries in the initial engagement and became unable to continue operating. Your unit was part of the extraction response, right? Pete was quiet for a moment. The Krath fighters who were with us, they kept moving, but they were slower. After injuries, they moved like they were fighting through something heavy. The adrenaline analog focuses them, but also increases physical tension response, Vale said. It compromises fine motor function. They become powerful, but less precise. And humans, Pete said, slowly, working through it. Stay precise? Val looked at him steadily. You ran uphill for 15 minutes after a Thoric-grade disruptor wound, navigating terrain, managing 12 civilians and 1 uncooperative elder, maintaining enough social and tactical awareness to notice that there was a secondary insurgent unit blocking your primary route, and choose an alternate path. Yes, she said. Humans appear to stay precise. There was a different kind of silence this time. Not the baffled silence from the night before. Something more considered. Dr. Harvin Tulka appeared in the bay doorway at this precise moment, took one look at the scene, and entered with the expression of a being who had already emotionally prepared for this kind of morning. Harvin was Vale's senior colleague on the Viridian, an older Melkari physician with decades of multi-species experience and a pragmatic, unhurried manner that made him excellent at long-term patient care and moderately frustrating in urgent situations. He was also the only other crew member on the Viridian who had treated humans before. He looked at the scan display. He looked at Pete. He looked at Vale's notes tablet. He's the one from last night, Harvin said to Vale. The Relo's 4th extraction. Corporal Pete Okafor, Vale said. 3rd disruptor hit. Self-directed recovery is at approximately 2.4 times projected rate. Harvin made a sound that was not quite any identifiable word but communicated volumes. He pulled up a secondary stool and sat down without being invited, which was simply how Harvin operated. Young man, he said to Pete, I treated a human soldier about 2 years ago. She had sustained a pressure trauma injury that should have kept her in medical observation for a week. How long did she stay? Pete asked. 31 hours, Harvin said. She left to return to duty, and I spent the following 3 days reviewing everything I thought I understood about sentient biology. He folded his hands. I want to ask you something, and I want you to understand I'm asking it in the spirit of genuine medical inquiry, not judgment. Sure, Pete said. Do you understand that you are injured? Pete blinked. Yes, not abstractly, not as information. Do you feel, at this moment, that your body is in a state that requires attention and care? Pete was quiet, and Vale could see him doing something genuine, actually checking inward, running some kind of honest internal assessment, rather than giving a default response. I feel like I need to finish healing, Pete said finally. I know the wound is real and significant. I know it needs the treatment you're giving it, but I don't feel. He searched for the word, fragile. I don't feel like I'm in danger of breaking. I feel like I'm in process. Harvin looked at Vale. Vale looked at Harvin. They had worked together long enough that this exchange communicated a complete and specific conversation without requiring any of its actual words to be spoken aloud. In process, Harvin said. That's a remarkably precise description. I spent 4 years as a paramedic, Pete said. You learn to know the difference between a body that's losing the fight and a body that's working through it. I know what the losing version feels like. This isn't it. Vale had a thought then. It arrived fully formed, which was how her best clinical insights tended to work, and it reframed every piece of data she had collected across the last 12 hours into a coherent picture that made her want to sit very still for a moment. You're not just healing faster than projected, she said. Pete looked at her. Your physiological response, the pain suppression, the motor continuity, the accelerated repair, the dynamic resource allocation, she said, speaking carefully because she wanted to get this right. It isn't a collection of separate anomalous traits. It's a system. A coherent, integrated system designed to keep a biological organism functional under conditions that should, by any standard model, result in functional failure. Harvin was very still. Pete waited. Your species, Vale said, did not evolve in a safe environment. It wasn't a question, but Pete answered it anyway. No, he said, very quietly. We really didn't, and something in the way he said it, without drama, without pride, just a simple and complete acknowledgement of a fact, made the full weight of it land in the medical bay in a way that Vale felt somewhere behind her sternum. She had treated Krath, who were built for strength. She had treated Delvani, who were built for endurance through redundancy. She had treated Brune, who were built for resilience. Each of those species had adapted to their environments in ways that made them formidable within a specific set of parameters. Humans had adapted to an environment that had, apparently, thrown every possible parameter at them simultaneously, and the result was an organism that didn't specialize in surviving any one category of threat. It specialized in surviving, full stop, as a general and ongoing operational mode. Harvin exhaled slowly. I'm going to update the human physiological file again, he said, to no one in particular. How many times have you updated it? Pete asked. This will be the 4th revision, Harvin said. And I have a feeling it won't be the last. Pete smiled. It was the same easy smile from the night before. But Vale was looking at it differently now. She understood it better. It was not the smile of someone who didn't take things seriously. It was the smile of someone who had made a fundamental peace with difficulty, who had, at some point in their life or their species' history, reached an arrangement with hardship that looked, from the outside, like ease. She finished the morning treatment in near silence, which Pete accepted without trying to fill it, which she found, to her mild surprise, comfortable rather than awkward. When she was done, she stepped back and told him that she wanted him in observation for another 24 hours, and he agreed without the negotiating she had half expected. I do have one question, Pete said, as she was making her final notes. Yes, you said my species is impossible last night. He wasn't challenging her. His tone was genuinely curious. Do you still think that? Vale considered the question seriously. She reviewed the scans in her mind, the injury data, the recovery progression, everything Harvin had said and everything she had worked out herself in the last hour. No, she said. I think I was using impossible when I meant outside my existing framework. Those aren't the same thing. She looked at him directly. You are entirely possible. You are simply operating by a set of rules that I hadn't encountered before. That is a different problem. A better problem? Pete asked. Vale picked up her tablet and her scanner and moved toward the bay entrance because she had a full-duty rotation ahead of her, and she had already spent more time in this conversation than any single patient typically received. At the doorway, she paused. Yes, she said, without turning around. A considerably better problem. She heard him laugh behind her. A short, genuine, uncomplicated sound. She catalogued it because she was precise and because she had a feeling, the clear and slightly inconvenient feeling of a researcher who has just found a subject worth studying, that this was not the last data point she was going to collect from Corporal Pete Okafor of the 14th Human Expeditionary Unit. She was correct about that, as it turned out. But that, as they say across most of the known systems, is another story entirely.